I want to address a theory that now and again circulates on social media and YouTube. The claim that this rather creepy, naturally mummified head found in a London church in 1852 is the head of Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, the father of Lady Jane Grey, Queen for 9 days. In this short video, I'll explore where this bizarre suggestion came from. I will then talk about the rather sinister and scandalous event that took place in the burial vault of the church where this head was found, and why that awful event makes it much more likely that this is the head of Mr Green the Grocer from 18th century Stepney than that of a Tudor Duke. I first came across the story of this mummified head in a fabulous little book called Unknown London, written in 1920 by a journalist from the Daily Telegraph called Walter George Bell. The volume is a bit like my YouTube channel, a series of articles on various eclectic subjects that just happened to engage and interest Mr Bell. Bell provides a photographic image of the head as the book's frontispiece, which immediately hooked me in. In Unknown London, Bell provides an account of his visit to see this head, which was at that time in the Church of the Holy Trinity Minories. Now, Holy Trinity was a 17th century church built on what was probably the nave of a monastery that was lost at the dissolution of the monasteries, the Abbey of the Minoresses or Poor Clares. That monastery was incidentally where Anne Mowbray, the wife of Richard Duke of York, was buried. I have a video all about the discovery of her remains under a bombed out site in 1964. Now, Holy Trinity was closed for worship in 1899 and converted into a parish room, and then, like much of Stepney, was more or less flattened in the Blitz in the Second World War. Bell's visit must have taken place sometime before the church was closed in 1899, and the head was then moved to St Botolph's Aldgate. Now, Bell knocks on the verger's door and is shown into the church, which is a typical Georgian interior with 18th century box pews, and a little cupboard is then opened up and the head in a glass case is brought forth for him to see, and the verger then rehearses a well-practiced story of its provenance. The story related to Bell is that the head had been found in 1852 in a vault below the church by the 4th Earl of Dartmouth. Generations of the Dartmouth family had been buried in the vaults, and the Earl was visiting his ancestor's grave. The mummified head was found lying in a basket full of sawdust, and there was clear evidence, whoever the head might belong to, that it had been severed from the body with some violence. Now, Holy Trinity Minories is not all that far from the Tower of London, and between the tower and the church is Tower Hill, which was the principal place of execution for members of the nobility throughout the medieval and early modern period. One of the people executed there was Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, a man close to the crown in the reign of Edward VI and a member of the Privy Council under the Duke of Northumberland's administration. Suffolk had a connection with the Minories, for in 1552 he had been granted the site of the abbey, though there's no evidence that he ever lived there, as he had other residences in the city. When King Edward VI died in 1553, Northumberland and Suffolk attempted to place Suffolk's daughter Jane Grey, who was married to Northumberland's son Guildford Dudley, on the throne. Now, Jane Grey did have a good claim to the throne. Her maternal grandmother, Mary Tudor, was the sister of Henry VIII. Edward VI, that he was dying, was under a certain amount of duress from the Privy Council to change his will, and so he did, and he disinherited his sisters Mary and Elizabeth and put Jane Grey as the first in line of succession. This action was motivated partly by a fear of Catholic Mary reversing the Reformation, but also the ambition of Northumberland and Suffolk. 16-year-old Jane and 18-year-old Guildford were simply pawns in their parents' power play. The plan, of course, failed, and Mary I, Henry VIII's eldest daughter, did succeed to the throne. During 1554, Northumberland, Suffolk, and the unfortunate Jane and Guildford all lost their heads. Suffolk was executed at Tower Hill on a chilly day in February of 1554. He went to the scaffold with great courage. His head was cleanly and efficiently removed from his body with a single blow of the axe. He was buried in the chapel of St Peter ad Vincula in the Tower of London, where Jane, Guildford and Northumberland were all laid to rest too. The fate of Suffolk's head is unknown. It may have been laid in the grave with him, but it was usual for the heads of traitors to be displayed on a spike over the southern entrance of Old London Bridge. Or was it? The verger at Holy Trinity Minories told Mr Bell at the end of the 19th century that this mummified head found in 1852 under the church was the head of the Duke of Suffolk, that it had been returned home, and that the basket of sawdust was the executioner's basket. It was a great story, but where did it start? Now, I've traced the story back as far as 1877, where it is first published in a work by Doyne Courtney Bell called The Notices of the Historic Persons Buried in the Chapel of St Peter ad Vincula in the Tower of London. Bell was a civil servant and an amateur antiquary who was particularly fascinated by the burial places of the royal family and was at pains to determine who was buried in St Peter ad Vincula and where. He went to the Minories to see the head in the company of Sir George Scharf, the first keeper of the newly formed National Portrait Gallery, Dr Frederick Moat, an esteemed surgeon, and Mr A.B. Mitford, Secretary of the Office of Works. He would later become the first Lord Redesdale and was the grandfather of the famous Mitford sisters. So Bell went along already believing that this was the head of the Duke of Suffolk, and he brought these experts along simply to confirm his conclusions. Sir George Scharf examined the head carefully, Bell says, and declared a clear likeness between the head and a portrait of the Duke of Suffolk in the National Portrait Gallery's collection. People said at the time that there was no better judge than Scharf of a historical head, whether on canvas or in a mummified state, although he failed with this one, as the portrait he was using for comparison was from the 1570s and wasn't Suffolk at all, but Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, the Duke of Northumberland's son. Dr Frederick Moat then passed his scientific judgment. The neck showed evidence, he claimed, that beheading was the cause of death and that the head was hacked off with 2 blows of an instrument to the back of the head. This was curious, as the contemporary accounts of Suffolk's execution suggest the work was cleanly performed in 1 blow. Now, Moat was also an advocate of the pseudoscience of physiognomy, and then goes on to say that all the evidence one needed that this was indeed the head of Suffolk, a man whom you might argue had little judgment and too much ambition, was to be seen on the features of the head. If there be any truth, he said, in external cranial indications of mental and moral manifestations, the skull tends to prove indecision of character, considerable self-esteem and very moderate reasoning power. In truth, Bell is much more hesitant in writing than his experts, and does not state conclusively that he believes this to be Suffolk's head. Now, it seems to me that people often prefer to gravitate to bizarre and unlikely historical theories rather than the more interesting and obvious conclusions that come from following historical evidence. Other less questioning writers latched on to Bell's theory as though it were gospel truth, and one of these was the Reverend Samuel Kinns, who in 1898 wrote a history of the Minories in which he doesn't question for one single minute that the head was that of the Duke of Suffolk. In fact, Kinns further elaborated the story, hypothesising that the executioner was bribed to bring the head secretly to the church and place it in the vault. Kinns claims that during his incumbency he was twice offered £1,000 for the head, and that an American gentleman offered to write him a cheque for £500 on the spot if he would let him have it. Although Kinns contemplated selling the mummified head, as the church then needed repair, the Bishop of London forbade it. Therein lies, I think, why this story was promoted by both Kinns and his verger. Visitors to the church must have provided some well-needed income, an income that was staving off, at least for a time, the closure of the church. There is no evidence at all that this is the Duke of Suffolk's head, and it is much more likely to be that of a person buried in the 18th century burial vaults under Holy Trinity when they were then active. Although a medieval foundation, the church fell into ruin and was completely reconstructed in 1707, and the vaults below were reconstructed too. Like all the 18th century burial vaults of London, they were soon filled up. Nothing remained by the mid-19th century of the church or any of the buildings that would have been present on the site in the 1550s. The chance of the head of the Duke being transferred in a receptacle as ephemeral as a basket of sawdust from the old building to the 18th century building is very slim indeed. A perfectly good and rather grisly explanation exists for the man's real identity. In 1907, Edward Tomlinson, who had been vicar of the Minories in the 1870s and 1880s, published a new history of the Minories. It is much more scholarly than the anecdotal work of Mr Kins. Mr Tomlinson was responsible during his incumbency for preserving the curious relic in a glass case, and he records that in 1786 Holy Trinity Minories became the centre of a scandal. Like many London churches, Holy Trinity had been constructed above a large series of burial vaults that followed the footprint of the main church. Now, as London's population increased in the 18th century, the burial vaults in churches across the city became very busy and full. Burials in them provided a valuable source of revenue for the church and its clergy. Most London parishes employed full-time sextons or gravediggers to manage their churchyards and the subterranean vaults. Some of these men were highly unscrupulous, and that was the case with the sexton of Holy Trinity Minories. The parish sexton in the 1780s was a man with a gloriously Dickensian name, Mr Smallcole. Now, sextons weren't paid all that well, and Smallcole found a rather grisly way of making a few extra shillings from his work. He was one of the only people with a key to the burial vaults, and very few people wanted to go down there, unsurprisingly. And hidden from view, with little chance of being caught, he was removing the dead from their coffins and breaking up the coffin material. Presumably he was selling the lead from the coffins, and was seemingly either selling or recycling the wood. And that is how he was caught. One of his neighbours saw him sawing up planks of curious-looking timber, and when they entered his house they realised that the floorboards of Mr Smallcole's house were made entirely of coffin wood. When the churchwardens were alerted, they then entered the vaults, and an awful sight was in front of them. A published account of the time records their first impression. The vaults had nearer resemblance to a slaughterhouse than a place of Christian burial. Smallcole wasn't simply ejecting the dead from their coffins, he seems to have been dismembering them too, and the churchwardens were shocked to see on the lid of a coffin the hind quarters of an old inhabitant who had not been interred more than 8 months. The warden drew the remains of another human body from the top of some of the other coffins, with the flesh still hanging to the bones. Presumably, Mr Smallcole was dismembering the corpses in the vaults to dispose of them elsewhere. What is surprising is, despite the public outrage at the time, and even ballads being written about the terrible actions of Smallcole, nothing was actually done. He wasn't dismissed. The churchwardens simply asked for his repentance, and rather than dealing with the chaos he had created, they closed the vaults to further burials. Everything remained as Smallcole had left it until the early 19th century. In 1824, 40 years after the scandal, there was some attempt to sort things out, and in 1844 further attempts were made to create order from the chaos. £35 was spent on that operation in 1844. It was during the course of further clearing and tidying work in 1852 that the Earl of Dartmouth found the mummified head in the basket of sawdust. Tomlinson is very clear in his mind that the head cannot be that of the Duke, and that the apparent severing of the neck was post-mortem and was a result of Mr Smallcole's grisly work. It is likely that the basket of sawdust is not a headman's basket, but was Smallcole's method of removing body parts from the vault unnoticed. After Holy Trinity Minories was closed in 1899, the head was removed to St Botolph Aldgate, where it was kept in yet another cupboard, but it was eventually buried in a biscuit tin in a vault under the church steps. It was rediscovered there in 1988 by the rector Malcolm Johnson, and according to his book, The Crypts of London, he buried it still in the biscuit tin under the floor of the west crypt of the church, where hopefully it will now remain undisturbed. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this channel, you're bound to enjoy my magazine, The Antiquary. Published every month, it is a labour of love for me, and in it I explore some of the more obscure aspects of our shared history, all beautifully illustrated in full colour. It ships across the world, is offered in print and digital format, and readers give it 5 stars on Google. If you love your history like me, particularly the history of objects, buildings, people and places, why not consider subscribing? Subscribing helps support my work and the channel too. There's a link above and in the video description that takes you to the magazine website.